Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Joan stood frozen behind the marble pillar in the dimly lit hallway of the Obiora mansion. Her hands trembled as she clasped the silver tray that had minutes ago carried drinks to the upstairs lounge. But what she heard now was more bitter than any wine she could serve. From the slightly open door to the private study, the voices of Gideon and Nonso echoed low and fierce. The car will be parked at the west exit. The moment he turns the ignition, it's over, Gideon muttered. He won't see it coming. Nobody will. And with him gone, it's ours. No more little brother acting like he's king. Joan's mouth dried instantly. The idea that two blood relatives of her kind-hearted boss, Kelvin Obiora, were plotting his murder felt like the floor was giving way beneath her. For years, she had moved like a shadow in this house, invisible, unseen, unheard. But tonight, her ears had captured a secret too dangerous to ignore. Retreating silently, Joan disappeared into the back corridor, her feet light but her mind heavy. She couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Kelvin's calm smile and heard the ticking of a bomb. Though she was just a maid, a background figure in a world of private jets, board meetings, and billionaire deals, she knew what she heard. She weighed her choices. Keep silent and hope it wasn't real, or risk everything and speak. Her room, small and tucked behind the servants' quarters, felt like a cage that night. Her mother once told her, "Truth is a sword. Sometimes it cuts through lies, but sometimes it cuts through your own safety too." Joan pressed her palm against her chest and prayed. Something told her that keeping silent would mean she would one day be serving a funeral meal instead of breakfast. By midnight, Joan stood outside Kelvin's door with hesitant knuckles. The grand hallway was cold, and even the portraits on the wall seemed to watch her. She knocked, barely breathing. Kelvin answered, casually dressed in a white shirt and joggers, surprised to see her. "Joan?" At this hour, he asked with confusion but kindness. She swallowed hard. "Sir, I heard something. I wasn't eavesdropping, I promise. But Mr. Gideon and Mr. Nonso, they're planning to harm you. Tomorrow." He blinked, then gave a soft laugh, as if trying to be polite. "Joan, I know my brother. He talks tough sometimes. You must have misunderstood." She insisted gently, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, please, just don't take your car tomorrow. Please." He thanked her, but his smile was tired. "I appreciate your concern. Get some rest, okay?" And just like that, the door closed. Joan stood there, numb. The whisper had been spoken. Now, all she could do was wait for dawn. Kelvin Obiora reclined in his leather chair the following morning, sipping black coffee as the sunrise painted golden streaks across the skyline of Lagos. His mind flickered back to Joan's midnight visit, and he chuckled lightly. "Joan is a good girl," he muttered, "but she's just a maid. Too many movies, perhaps." He remembered how serious her eyes looked, how her voice quivered not with drama, but with desperation. Still, it didn't make sense to him. Gideon was rough around the edges, yes, but he was his elder brother. Nonso too had his flaws, overspending, shady dealings in the past. But even they wouldn't stoop to something as outrageous as murder, would they? He had always tried to believe the best in family. Their father had preached it to them again and again. Family above fortune. Blood over business. That belief was the very reason Kelvin often turned the other cheek when Gideon stormed into board meetings late or failed to deliver promised results. After breakfast, Kelvin called Gideon. The tone was warm. "Brother, morning. Just checking in," he said. Gideon was unusually cheerful. "Kelvo, I'm fine, just heading to the site today. Heard the Port Harcourt deal cleared. Congrats, boss man." Kelvin smiled. "Thanks, Gid. Drive safe." The call ended with casual laughter, but something in Gideon's voice gnawed at Kelvin. It was too smooth, too eager. He shrugged it off, grabbed his keys, and headed toward his sleek black Mercedes parked at the western garage exit, the very place Joan had warned about. He sat in the car, tossed his phone on the seat, and took a breath. "It's going to be a good day," he whispered to himself. As he turned the ignition, there was a sharp sound, like a pop. Then heat. Then silence. The explosion rocked the estate. Smoke filled the morning air. The guard screamed. Staff came running. By the time Joan heard the blast, her knees buckled beneath her. She clutched the wall, praying he had listened. But she knew deep down that he hadn't. Emergency crews rushed in. News spread fast. Billionaire Calvin Obiora, presumed dead in a car explosion. Gideon arrived shortly after with tears and screams. Nonso fainted on the lawn. Joan stood in the background, invisible again, her eyes red but dry. She knew the truth, and it killed her. Not just that Calvin was gone, but that he hadn't believed her. Not until it was too late. But fate had not finished writing its lines yet. In the outskirts of Lagos, in a hidden private clinic known only to the richest elites, Calvin lay breathing. Burn marks covered his side, his left arm was fractured, and his head bore cuts, but he was alive. He had been pulled from the wreckage by a guard named Chucks, who disobeyed an early dismissal order and lingered longer than expected. Chucks had panicked when he saw the fire, and dragged Calvin out before the car fully exploded. The billionaire was unconscious for hours. By the time he awoke, pain stitched through his body, but he remembered Joan, her whisper, her face, her warning. And for the first time in years, he realized someone had loved him enough to speak truth. And he had laughed in her eyes. Calvin's security manager and Chucks were sworn to secrecy. A cover story was released. Calvin Obiora had perished. Gideon and Nonso celebrated privately, unaware they had failed. Calvin, now hidden in a borrowed name under armed watch, demanded one thing first: find Joan. Bring her to me. Quietly. When Joan saw him in the hidden clinic later that night, she broke down in tears, not from fear or grief, but relief. I thought you were gone, she sobbed. He touched her hand gently. I should have listened to you. I'm sorry, Joan. You saved my life. And from that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a bond no status, wealth, or bloodline could explain. Together, they began planning. Calvin's mind, once built for profit and innovation, now turned toward strategy and survival. He started going through old emails, reviewing Gideon's latest projects. Joan, still unnoticed by those who dismissed her as just a maid, offered to return to the estate as a cleaner under a fake name. They won't suspect me. I know every corner of that house, she said. Calvin hesitated, not wanting to put her at risk. But Joan stood firm. Sir, you trusted your blood and almost died. Now trust the one who whispered. Calvin looked at her and nodded. The war had begun, quietly, invisibly, but with more power than they imagined. And this time, the whisper would become a roar. In the quiet of the private clinic hidden far from Lagos spotlight, Calvin's world was beginning to reshape itself. No longer did he think like a billionaire seated in a glass office tower. He thought like a hunted man. Pain coursed through his body, but it was nothing compared to the searing ache of betrayal. His brother, Gideon, the man who once taught him how to ride a bicycle and stood by him in their mother's burial, had tried to kill him. Nonso, the cousin he once gave a second chance after catching him stealing company funds, was now a conspirator. The wound wasn't just physical. It was ancestral. A poison that had flowed through the Obiora bloodline long before the explosion. Calvin sat in silence most days, his right arm still wrapped, his ribs aching with every breath. But his mind moved faster than ever. I have no business being a ghost, he told Joan one evening. But I need to be one if I'm going to reclaim my name. Joan had begun preparations to infiltrate the Obiora estate again, with the help of Calvin's discreet associate, a female lawyer named Clara, who had once worked in his father's will arbitration. Joan's identity was carefully altered. She would no longer be the soft-spoken maid they all remembered. Now she would return as a temporary janitor assigned by a third-party cleaning agency subcontracted by one of the office's less regulated vendors. Joan cut her hair, darkened her skin with harmless tint powder to avoid facial recognition from security footage, and learned to speak with a different cadence. They will never know it's me, she said with quiet confidence. I have served them long enough to understand how they see us, invisible. Kelvin looked at her with a strange mix of admiration and guilt. She was risking her life for him. No family would do what she was doing. Not even blood. "Why are you doing this?" he asked her one night. Her answer was soft. "Because I still believe that good people deserve to win." The next day, Joan re-entered the Obiora estate under her new alias. Her heart pounded as she walked past the grand gates she once opened every morning with a mop and prayer. But now she entered with purpose and fear. Inside, nothing had changed. The walls still glittered with wealth. The halls still carried the scent of imported polish and privilege. But the soul of the mansion had darkened. Gideon was often absent, flying in and out with arrogant strides, while Nonso now moved like a miniature king, barking orders, drinking champagne by noon. They believed Kelvin was gone, buried by their greed, and now ruled with casual cruelty. Joan watched quietly, cataloging documents, memorizing briefcases, listening to late-night meetings. No one recognized her. But deep inside, she felt like a candle burning in the middle of a hurricane. And as she swept the same floors she once knew like family, she realized this was not the house she used to clean. It had become a fortress of betrayal. Long before the explosion, long before the whispers of conspiracy, there were 3 boys sitting beneath a mango tree outside their father's old office: Gideon, Kelvin, and Nonso. Back then, they were children bonded by rice and bruises, chasing lizards and shouting over football games. Gideon was the oldest and loudest. He led with fists, not reason. Nonso was always beside him, laughing at everything, eager to please. Kelvin, the youngest, preferred books and silence. When their father, Chief Damien Obiora, would step outside after a meeting, he'd often shake his head. 3 boys, 3 storms, he'd say. But even then, it was clear who would carry the future. Kelvin followed their father into meetings by age 12, sat quietly beside him during weekend audits, and once stayed awake all night learning how interest rates worked just to impress him. Gideon, on the other hand, was busy buying drinks for his friends with money he borrowed and never returned. Their father saw everything, but he never yelled. He watched. He judged in silence. The seeds of envy were not planted by words. They were planted in how Chief Obiora looked at Kelvin. A simple glance of approval during family dinners. A soft nod when Kelvin offered advice during company retreats. Gideon noticed. And so did Nonso. The elder son tried hard to match Kelvin, bought suits, showed up at board meetings, even mimicked Kelvin's calm demeanor. But it always fell apart. The investors didn't trust him. He lacked vision. When Chief Obiora gave Kelvin a small failing branch of the business to test his leadership, Kelvin turned it into a profitable unit in 8 months. Gideon watched from the shadows as his younger brother became everything he wanted to be, not by force, but by patience. Their father still gave Gideon allowances, fancy cars, and a useless title, special consultant to the chairman. But behind closed doors, Gideon fumed. "You think you're better than me because of a spreadsheet," he once spat at Kelvin during a family gathering. Kelvin had only smiled sadly and walked away. He didn't need to answer that. Nonso was more subtle. He floated between the brothers, pretending to mediate while feeding Gideon's bitterness in private. He once said, "It's unfair, Gid. You're the first son. This throne was yours." But in truth, Nonso didn't care who wore the crown. He just wanted a cut. When he started stealing small funds from a warehouse branch, it was Kelvin who caught it. Instead of exposing him, Kelvin gave him a chance to return the money and change. "Do better," Kelvin had said, "because one more slip and you're out." That quiet mercy only deepened the resentment. Gideon saw it as Kelvin rubbing his success in their faces. Nonso saw it as condescension. From then on, they began whispering behind closed doors. "He thinks he's father now," Gideon said one night. "Let's see how he acts without his breath." The fall of Gideon Obiora did not come with thunder. It came in stages, the way a wall cracks slowly before it collapses. The first stage was the nightclub scandal. Photos leaked of him in Ghana partying with cartel-linked foreigners, splurging company money on gold watches and models. The boardroom exploded with tension. Chief Obiora sat at the head of the table in stony silence, while media headlines swirled. Gideon offered excuses. Those are fake reports. I was networking. This is a setup. But the shareholders were furious. It took Kelvin's quiet diplomacy to calm the storm, convincing partners to hold off on public backlash until things were sorted. Still, something changed in that meeting. Chief Obiora looked at Gideon that day not with anger, but with disappointment. And that hurt more than any slap could. Stage 2 came when Gideon attempted to launch a tech division without approval. He invested millions into a fake cryptocurrency scheme, promising Obiora Group would be the next Tesla of Africa. By the time Kelvin found out, they had lost 800 million Nigerian nairas. Chief Obiora nearly collapsed from a shock. For the first time, he called a private meeting and stripped Gideon of authority. From now on, you will no longer represent Obiora Group in any public or private engagement, he said. Your role is honorary only. Kelvin will take over full management. Gideon laughed in that moment, a painful, bitter laugh. So this is how you repay your first son, he spat. Chief Obiora remained calm. This is how I protect my legacy. Gideon stormed out of the room. Behind him, the empire had officially changed hands. The third and final stage was emotional. As their father aged, his health declined. Gideon visited less. He began to hang around Nonso more, drinking heavily and ranting about betrayal. He took what was mine, Gideon often said. They gave my crown to a choir boy. Meanwhile, Kelvin worked harder. He brought in foreign investors, doubled profits, and expanded their logistics unit to 5 more states. Even staff who once favored Gideon now rallied behind Kelvin. It wasn't just about blood anymore. It was about trust. The empire now rested firmly in Kelvin's hands, and Gideon, once the future, became a shadow of the past. But a shadow that still moved. A shadow that still watched. And in that shadow, something darker grew. Not just envy, but the readiness to destroy. From a young age, Kelvin had always known when to be quiet, and more importantly, when to listen. While Gideon stormed into conversations demanding attention, and Nonso cracked jokes to mask his ignorance, Kelvin observed. He was often found beside their father in the garden or tucked into one corner of the study, flipping through files or asking questions most teenagers wouldn't care to ask. Chief Obiora noticed. You don't talk much, he once said to Kelvin during a quarterly board meeting when Kelvin was just 19. But when you do, you speak with thought. That single line cemented something in Kelvin's mind. His value would not be found in noise, but in wisdom. When the company suffered a shipping delay crisis due to faulty management in the Port Harcourt division, Gideon blamed the logistics team. Nonso laughed it off. But Kelvin went down to the site personally, interviewed the local staff, analyzed the records, and found the loophole. Within 2 weeks, not only was the delay resolved, but the entire system was updated to prevent it from ever happening again. The board was stunned. Investors began whispering his name, the quiet genius of Obiora Group. His father began to see what he had quietly hoped for, a successor not just in blood, but in spirit. Yet, for Kelvin, it was never about outshining anyone. He loved the company because it was his father's life work, and through it, he connected to the man who had raised him with firm discipline and deep affection. Kelvin never argued about who deserved what. He earned it through service. One year, when a major investor from South Africa arrived unexpectedly and Gideon was nowhere to be found, it was Kelvin who hosted him. He gave a detailed presentation, walked the man through the factory floors, and personally negotiated a new supply agreement. His father didn't say much afterward, only gave a firm nod and a rare smile. Gideon, however, noticed. That night, he drank alone and punched a mirror in his room. He's making me look like the spare, he muttered through bloodied knuckles. The relationship between the brothers was growing cold. Kelvin tried to bridge the gap, offering Gideon help, suggesting they co-lead certain projects. I don't need charity, Gideon snapped. I was here before you. The bitterness deepened when their father asked Kelvin to start attending high-level board meetings officially as his successor in training. Gideon was left out of that loop entirely. Even Nonso, ever the pretender, started keeping distance from Gideon, sensing he was no longer the favorite. But Gideon wasn't blind. He saw how the tides were shifting. He saw how Kelvin's calm strength was outshining his thunderous declarations. And most of all, he saw the gleam in his father's eyes whenever Kelvin entered a room. That gleam used to belong to him. And now, as it faded, Gideon made a silent vow in his heart, "If I cannot wear the crown in peace, then no one will." Of all the people in the Obiora family business, Nonso was perhaps the most dangerous, not because he was the smartest, but because he was the most invisible. He smiled when he was supposed to, laughed at everyone's jokes, carried documents without question, and rarely disagreed with anyone in power. Most mistook him for a harmless loyalist. Even Chief Obiora once said, "Nonso is obedient, but he lacks leadership." In truth, Nonso had long accepted that he would never sit on the throne, but he also knew he didn't need a crown to steal gold. He quietly studied the business, not to lead it, but to leech from it. He began small, approving fake vendor invoices, claiming transport reimbursements for trips never taken, and inflating prices on imported materials. It was Kelvin who first noticed discrepancies. "Why is the account for the Eastern Wing showing double expenditures in just one quarter?" he asked during a financial review. The CFO blamed it on a misfiled report. But Kelvin wasn't satisfied. He investigated further, and that's when Nonso's quiet schemes began to unravel. Kelvin didn't publicly expose him. Instead, he called him in privately and confronted him with the evidence. "I can bury this," Kelvin said, "but only if you stop now." Nonso had nodded quickly, begged for forgiveness, and promised to clean up the mess. But as he walked out of the room, shame burned in his chest. Not because he was caught, but because it was Kelvin, the boy he once mocked for being too serious, who now had the power to destroy him. That moment created a silent storm in Nonso's heart. He didn't go clean. Instead, he got smarter. He found new ways to hide the embezzlement and began whispering more often in Gideon's ears. "Kelvin thinks he's our father," he would say. "He gives warnings like he's already king." Slowly, Nonso began grooming Gideon's insecurity, feeding it like a snake. He needed Gideon angry enough to act. Because if Gideon moved against Kelvin, Nonso knew he could pick up the pieces afterward, maybe even claim what remained. To the outside world, Nonso was still the faithful cousin. He followed Gideon around like a second shadow, and bowed to Kelvin during meetings. But behind the scenes, he was writing checks to shell companies, shifting funds, and manipulating project approvals. With Chief Obiora now battling health issues, the internal eyes that once kept the company's moral compass in check were beginning to close. One day, when Kelvin found yet another missing 20 million Nigerian nairas tied to a non-existent warehouse lease, he called a family-only meeting. He laid out the figures, the timeline, and the documents. Nonso laughed nervously. "Maybe someone's using my signature," he joked. But Chief Obiora was no fool. "This is theft," he said flatly. "If this were anyone else, I'd call the police." Still, he looked tired. Old. Too old for war. That day, Chief Obiora didn't punish Nonso publicly. He simply removed him from 3 upcoming contracts and told him not to return to the company office until further notice. That soft exile should have humbled Nonso. Instead, it only made him dangerous. He left the office with a smile on his face, the same smile he wore when he first started stealing. Chief Damien Obiora lay in a hospital bed surrounded by the sterile scent of bleach and monitors. The great lion of the Obiora Empire, the man who once built an empire from a single cement truck and sweat, was now held up by tubes and a weak pulse. Kelvin stayed by his side through the long nights, reading quarterly updates softly to keep him company, while Gideon came and left with hollow eyes. The old man knew his time was near, and so he summoned his lawyer, Mr. Okoro, and ordered a final amendment to his will. "The company must not fall," he said, "not into the hands of pride. It must be led by purpose." The decision had already been made in his heart long before then, but now it would be sealed in ink. He wrote that Kelvin would be the full legal CEO and chairman of Obiora Group. Gideon would be granted honorary shares, enough to earn from dividends, but not enough to vote. Nonso's name was removed entirely. The lawyer hesitated. "Are you sure?" the man asked. Chief Obiora nodded. I love them all. But loving a child doesn't mean letting him ruin what you built. Gideon arrived at the hospital the next evening, reeking of alcohol, mumbling apologies, tears in his eyes. For a brief moment, he seemed like the boy he used to be. He even held his father's hand and whispered, I'm sorry for failing you. But Chief Obiora said something that haunted Gideon forever. You didn't fail me. You failed yourself. That night, the old man passed away. Kelvin was the one who stood outside to announce the news. Cameras flashed. The country mourned. And within a week, the will was read privately in the family compound. As the lawyer detailed the instructions, Gideon sat frozen, and Nonso's eyes widened. What? Gideon shouted. You left everything to him? To Kelvin. The lawyer repeated calmly. This was your father's decision. Gideon stormed out of the room. Nonso followed, whispering, we won't let this stand. That moment marked the end of innocence. The official transition ceremony was held, and Kelvin took the reins with grace, humility, and sorrow. Not because he was unworthy, but because he knew what it cost. Gideon didn't attend. Nonso made a vague statement to the press. And from that moment forward, the shadows around the Obiora legacy began to stir. Kelvin had inherited an empire, and two enemies who would never forgive him for it. The same men who once called him our brother and our blood now saw him as a throne thief. The whispers began quietly, but they would not stay quiet forever. From the moment the will was read, Gideon's eyes were never the same. They no longer held the fire of a firstborn or the pride of a man who once believed himself the rightful heir. Instead, they burned with something colder, calculated vengeance. The days following their father's funeral were unusually quiet. Gideon didn't shout or argue. He smiled politely at the board members, congratulated Kelvin in front of the press, and even appeared at the post-burial Thanksgiving with arms folded in false humility. But Kelvin, now seated at the top, began to feel the tremors beneath the surface. Company emails were mysteriously deleted. A foreign deal that was set to close suddenly collapsed after internal documents were leaked. Departments that once worked in unity were suddenly struggling with tension and misplaced files. Gideon claimed no knowledge. It must be a tech glitch, he said casually. But Kelvin knew better. He could feel it, like cold fingers tightening slowly around his crown. Nonso returned quietly as well, without formal reinstatement. He started hanging around Gideon's new consulting firm, occasionally showing up at company events or accompanying Gideon to charity galas. They claimed to be rebuilding the family's legacy, promising media outlets that Obiora Group was more than just one man. Kelvin chose not to fight them publicly. He still believed in preserving family image. But that grace came at a price. Slowly, Gideon began chipping away at Kelvin's image, feeding anonymous tips to reporters, spinning gossip into headlines. Kelvin Obiora unfit for legacy, one read. Former heir claims corruption in board appointments, said another. Though Kelvin's track record remained clean, the whispers grew loud enough to cast shadows on his achievements. It was death by reputation, and it was happening right under his nose. The final straw came when Kelvin learned from a trusted contact that Gideon and Nonso were secretly meeting with two of the foreign investors who once backed Obiora Group's expansion. These were people who had always supported Kelvin, until Gideon offered them access to a more inclusive leadership model. The betrayal was almost poetic. The same man who had squandered money, mocked responsibility, and failed their father was now positioning himself as the face of justice and redemption. Kelvin didn't react. Not yet. He simply sat in his office one night, long after everyone had left, staring out the window as Lagos buzzed below. He won't stop until he buries me, he whispered. It was no longer just about business. It was war, and it was now personal. In the early days of Kelvin's hiding, while the public still mourned the tragic death of their beloved billionaire, the war shifted into shadows. Joan had fully re-entered the Obiora estate under a false identity, assigned as a contracted cleaner for the internal audit firm hired by Gideon himself to clean house after Kelvin's supposed death. Her new name was Ifeoma, and her file stated she came from Quail in Delta State with no prior employment record. Thanks to Clara's legal maneuvering, no one paid attention to her. She swept floors, emptied bins, and listened. Oh, how she listened! The estate had changed. Gideon rarely stayed overnight, but had taken over Kelvin's private study. Nonso had moved into the guest house and converted it into his personal office space. Joan noticed documents being shredded often. A few times, she overheard heated conversations about shifting funds and adjusting the paper trail. What shocked her the most was how confident they had become, how careless. Meanwhile, Kelvin, from his secluded clinic-turned-command center, began building his ghost network. Using burner phones and encrypted email chains, he started intercepting financial reports that Joan retrieved discreetly. With Clara's help and 2 loyal IT engineers he once mentored, they slowly began accessing parts of the company's database. Kelvin couldn't directly log in. His credentials had been disabled the day after the explosion. But he didn't need direct access. Through ghost credentials and backdoor entries, he began altering small figures, just enough to confuse the accountants. He changed travel bookings, modified supplier numbers, and redirected confirmation emails. The goal wasn't to destroy anything. It was to disrupt. Confusion, suspicion, miscommunication. These were his new tools. And Joan was his eyes. One night, while working in Gideon's office, Joan discovered a file marked Blackwave Holdings. It looked like a shell company. Something about it felt wrong. She took pictures with her hidden phone and sent them immediately to Kelvin. When Clara examined the documents, her face paled. They're planning to move 3.2 billion Nigerian nairas through this fake company within the next month, she said. If we don't act fast, the company will be bankrupt by the time you return from the grave. But they couldn't go to the authorities yet. There was no proof linking it directly to Gideon or Nonso. Just paper trails. And the enemy was already growing suspicious. Joan could feel it in the way one of the guards stared at her too long the next day. The war had begun. It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. But it was deadly. And for the first time in her life, Joan was no longer a maid. She was a ghost, a threat, a weapon. As Joan continued her mission within the estate, her every move became more deliberate. She had developed a rhythm. Arrive early, clean the eastern wing first where Nonso kept his ledgers, then rotate to Gideon's quarters by late afternoon, always with a smile, always humming softly like the oblivious cleaner she was pretending to be. But underneath that routine beat the pulse of espionage. She had tucked a tiny voice recorder into her mop bucket and wore a bracelet fitted with a pin-sized camera Clara provided. Every suspicious comment, every tense argument, every reference to cleaning Kelvin's leftovers was recorded and sent to Kelvin each night. And yet, Joan never let her face show anything. She was invisible. Until she wasn't. Nonso's paranoia grew first. He began checking his drawers more often. He accused one of the interns of leaking information after a minor deal fell through. But Joan knew it was the pen recorder she had placed near the windowsill that had captured Nonso boasting about forging 3 new contracts under Kelvin's name. The recording had already been sent to a foreign law firm Kelvin was working with to build an external case. Joan's pulse quickened when Nonso walked past her that afternoon and stopped abruptly. "Have I seen you before?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "You look like someone I used to know." Joan gave a small, nervous laugh and said in a thick accent, "No, sir. Me be Ifioma from Agyum. First time in Lagos." He stared a second too long before walking away. That night, she slept with her shoes on, just in case she had to run. On the other side of the city, Kelvin began forming strategic alliances with people he once overlooked. A former investigative journalist named Musa, once fired for exposing corruption in the energy sector, joined the team. Musa helped trace Blackwave Holdings to a string of fake accounts linked to Nonso's offshore contacts. It wasn't enough to expose publicly yet, but it was getting close. Clara filed silent injunctions to prevent certain funds from being moved abroad, while Kelvin made a mysterious offer to one of Gideon's former assistants, a woman who had been humiliated by Gideon and quietly let go. "You'll have to be brave," Kelvin said, "because once we make this move, they'll know I'm not dead." The assistant nodded. They're already acting like gods. Maybe it's time they see what happens when ghosts come for vengeance. The pieces were moving. Slowly. Silently. But when they struck, it would be thunder. Gideon stood in front of a long, antique mirror inside Kelvin's old study, his eyes scanning the reflection with an intensity that unnerved even himself. He no longer saw a grieving brother or a man rising to power. He saw something unstable creeping beneath the skin. The empire he had dreamed of for so long was now in his hands, but it refused to sit still. Strange errors plagued his staff. Important calls went unanswered. Signed contracts vanished before they reached final desks. Suppliers claimed they'd never received emails Gideon swore he sent. Somebody is sabotaging us, he told Nonso, slamming a decanter of brandy onto the polished mahogany table. It's not the media, it's not the competition. It's like there's a ghost in the system. Nonso nodded nervously. Even he had noticed a shift. The once smooth money laundering channel through Blackwave Holdings was starting to clog with unexplained delays. Someone was jamming their path, and it wasn't coming from the outside. Later that evening, Gideon took an unexpected route through the estate as he wandered from the east wing toward the gardens. That's when he saw her, a cleaner by the flower shed, bent over a pile of documents that had spilled from a folder. She wore the brown and blue uniform of the cleaning agency, and her short natural hair was wrapped beneath a cheap scarf. But it was her eyes. Dark, quiet, intelligent. Familiar. He narrowed his gaze as she glanced up and quickly looked away. Something stirred in his memory. Joan, he whispered to himself, though he knew that couldn't be. Joan was dead, or missing at least, ever since Kelvin's death. But the way this woman moved, the silent grace of her posture, the careful way she retreated like someone trained to stay small, it didn't fit the usual cleaner profile. That night, Gideon couldn't sleep. He searched through old employee records, trying to pull Joan's file, but it had been mysteriously deleted months ago. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted in his mind, and it was growing. The next day, Gideon instructed his private security to quietly tail the cleaner named Iphioma. No questions. No confrontation, he said. Just watch her, everywhere she goes. He didn't tell Nonso about his suspicion yet. He needed to be sure. Meanwhile, Joan had sensed something had changed. The guards were too polite. The hallway too quiet when she walked through it. Her instincts told her she had been seen, maybe not exposed fully, but noticed. That evening, she sent an encrypted message to Kelvin. I think he saw me. Kelvin replied within minutes. Pull back now. We'll replace you with someone else. But Joan's next message was resolute. No. We're too close. Let me stay one more week. She had made it this far, dodged every eye, captured enough evidence to shake the ground beneath them. But she wasn't done yet. She couldn't run. Not now. Not while they still believed Kelvin was dead. Joan moved through the Obiora estate like a breeze in the wind, careful, light, nearly invisible. But under the weight of constant surveillance, the air had changed. The tale was subtle at first, a new security man she hadn't seen before casually sweeping the corridors after she left. Then came a cleaner who wasn't really cleaning, a woman who mirrored her every motion, always just nearby, never truly working. Joan adjusted quickly. She varied her cleaning routes, left no pattern, used backup devices hidden in places even she hadn't touched in weeks. But the pressure was mounting. On the third day of the tale, she returned to the tiny storage closet she used to charge her pin camera bracelet, only to find the charger missing and a strange scent of burnt plastic lingering in the air. They were getting close. Too close. She didn't panic, not visibly. But that night, she cried in the back corner of the compound near the generator room. The fear wasn't for herself. It was for Kelvin. If she was caught, everything would unravel. Meanwhile, Kelvin and Clara were monitoring the situation from their hideout with increased urgency. They had already compiled over 200 files of audio, transaction records, insider reports, and witness statements. The case was nearly court-ready. The only missing link? Proof of intent. Undeniable evidence that Gideon and Nonso knowingly planned Kelvin's death and coordinated the car explosion. Joan was their best chance to retrieve it. Clara begged her to pull out. "We can strike with what we have," she said. "We don't need you to be a martyr." But Joan refused. "I won't let him come back only to be questioned by the world. I want them buried in their lies," she said. Her voice didn't shake when she said it, but her fingers did. She was more than a maid now. She was the thread tying truth to vengeance, and she was determined to hold that thread to the end. On the fifth day, the attack came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. Joan had just finished wiping down the conference table in the West Wing when she stepped out into the hallway and was grabbed from behind. A hand covered her mouth, dragging her into a storage closet. She struggled, kicked, her feet scraping against the tiled floor. "You think you don't know who you are?" the masked voice hissed. "You should have stayed dead like your boss." Her heart stopped. They knew. But before the man could inject her with something cold from a hidden syringe, Joan reached behind her back and stabbed him in the thigh with a sharpened nail she had hidden in her waistband, a habit she picked up weeks earlier. He screamed, loosening his grip, and Joan ran. She didn't stop running until she was outside the estate wall, breathless, covered in blood, hiding inside a fish vendor's delivery truck. Her phone was gone, but her life was still hers. She was not just fighting anymore. She had declared war. The moment Kelvin heard what happened, his soul nearly collapsed. Clara had gotten word from Musa that Joan was missing from the estate, and a witness claimed to see a woman in a cleaner's uniform running into the nearby market area bleeding. For 3 hours, they feared the worst. Kelvin sat in silence, staring at the door, praying it would open with good news. When it finally did, Joan limped in, bruised but alive, escorted by Chucks, the same loyal guard who had once pulled Kelvin from the explosion. Her face was swollen, her left arm dislocated, but her eyes were clear. "They know," she said quietly. "They tried to inject me with something. It's time." Kelvin broke down. The man who had once sat at the top of an empire wept like a child, holding the maid who had sacrificed more than anyone ever should. "I should have never let you go back," he whispered. Joan smiled weakly. Then none of this would have come to light. For the next few days, Joan was hidden in a secret location outside of Lagos under armed protection. Kelvin, meanwhile, stepped into a new version of himself, no longer reactive, no longer patient. He had watched his company fall into the hands of vipers. He had watched the press celebrate his traitor brother. He had watched the woman who saved him nearly lose her life. Enough was enough. With Clara's legal groundwork, Musa's exposés, and the forensic evidence Joan had gathered, Kelvin was ready. But his return wouldn't be announced with trumpets. It would begin with a whisper, the same way it all started. Clara filed the first injunction to freeze Gideon and Nonso's personal accounts. She used a dummy shareholder in London to call an emergency audit. Kelvin hacked into the old surveillance system he had installed secretly and broadcasted a silent video. No face shown, just Nonso and Gideon discussing the explosion plan in Joan's recording. The boardroom froze. The whispers returned. But this time, not about Kelvin's failure, about Gideon's treachery. Investors called. Journalists sniffed. One former shareholder demanded answers on live television. Nonso began to panic. Gideon grew violent, smashing glass in his office, firing innocent staff, accusing his assistant of betrayal. But the walls were closing in. And for the first time since the explosion, Kelvin Obiora smiled. Not out of joy, but out of purpose. The storm had begun. And now they would feel the price of betrayal, not through bullets, but through collapse. Slow, methodical, merciless. The Obiora Group boardroom had never been this silent. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant skirts sat in pin-drop tension as Clara walked to the front of the long mahogany table. Her presence was a mystery. She was not a shareholder, not a known investor. Yet she had summoned the emergency audit using a rarely activated clause in Chief Obiora's inheritance bylaws, a clause that allowed for review in case of unusual executive behavior or suspected internal sabotage. Gideon, seated at the head of the table, tried to maintain his usual arrogance. "Who gave you this right?" he asked through clenched teeth. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened her silver briefcase and pulled out a black tablet. The screen lit up. A video played. The voice was unmistakable Gideon's, saying, "The moment he turns the ignition, it's over." Gasps echoed. Nonso stood from his chair, panicked. "That's fake," he shouted. But no one believed him. The video continued, revealing voices, laughter, and discussions about the shell company's payments and Kelvin's inevitable fall. And then silence. Clara's voice followed. "The man you tried to kill is alive. He has seen your treachery. He has heard every word. And he will return." The boardroom erupted into chaos. Phones buzzed. Shares dropped 5% in 30 minutes. Clara didn't answer questions. She simply walked out. Gideon followed her down the corridor. "Where is he?" "Where's Kelvin?" he growled. But Clara only smiled. "He's closer than you think." That night, Gideon could barely sleep. Journalists surrounded his estate. Emails flooded in. Former partners pulled out. The empire he had stolen was bleeding. Meanwhile, Nonso tried to access the company funds to transfer emergency capital abroad, but his passwords failed. Every account frozen. A notice popped up under federal anti-corruption investigation. He collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily. He's back. The bastard is back. In a secure hotel downtown, Kelvin sat in a quiet room overlooking the city skyline, watching the entire uproar unfold on television. He wasn't smiling. Revenge had never been his hunger. Truth was. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and whispered to the screen, "Let the vultures see the sun." Joan stood nearby, arms still wrapped, but eyes blazing with strength. "They look scared," she said. Kelvin nodded. "Fear is what they gave me. It's only right they drink from the same cup." For months, he had been dead to the world. But now the ghost was stepping back into the light, not for applause, but for reckoning. The world would soon know what Gideon and Nonso had done. But more importantly, the world would know who stopped them: a maid, a lawyer, a journalist, and a man who refused to die. By morning, Kelvin Obiora is alive trended across every major news outlet. Images of the boardroom video had leaked, pixelated, but powerful enough to set the nation ablaze. Old allies began to reappear. Investors who had withdrawn after Kelvin's death returned with cautious inquiries. Most were not driven by conscience, but self-preservation. Gideon, meanwhile, was cornered like a wounded animal. He held emergency press conferences denying the audio, claiming digital manipulation and corporate sabotage. Nonso tried to hide, staying out of public view, but a warrant for financial questioning had already been issued under the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, EFCC. Clara filed a suit to temporarily reinstate Kelvin as CEO pending investigation, a request so publicly justified that even skeptical courts were forced to consider it. But that was just the beginning. Kelvin wasn't seeking reinstatement alone. He was seeking judgment, and not in silence. A week later, the formal trial began, not criminal yet, but corporate. Kelvin walked into the Obiora courtroom, flanked by Clara and security guards. Cameras flashed wildly. Gideon was already seated, his face gaunt from stress, his hair thinner, his arrogance dimmed. As Kelvin entered, all eyes turned. He did not speak to Gideon. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder. One by one, Joan's recordings were played. Emails were printed, shown. Bank transfers traced from Nonso's offshore accounts. Secret phone conversations between Gideon and Blackwave's shadow financiers. The board sat stunned as the mountain of betrayal unfolded. Nonso tried to cry his way out of it. "I was following instructions. I didn't mean for him to die." But his tears were dry, and the evidence wet with blood. Gideon remained silent. For the first time in his life, he realized words were no longer weapons. He had nothing left to say. Then came the witness statements. Clara called forward the former assistant whom Kelvin had quietly contacted. She testified about overhearing plans, being forced to delete emails, and watching Gideon sign off on coded contracts. Then Joan, still bruised, entered the room. A hush fell. "Who are you?" one shareholder asked. "The maid," she replied. "The one who tried to save him, and the one you all ignored." Her testimony didn't just expose the plot. It exposed the rot. How power had blinded the system. How status made them deaf to those who knew the truth. When she finished, even the board applauded. Not for spectacle, but because she had said what none of them had the courage to say. That evening, as court adjourned, reporters followed Kelvin to the steps. "Sir, are you seeking vengeance or justice?" they asked. Kelvin answered calmly. "Justice has always been vengeance for the innocent. And it's their turn now." With the courtroom ignited and the evidence now in the public domain, Gideon and Nonso found themselves surrounded by a country that no longer believed in their lies. Nonso tried to flee the next morning using a private airstrip outside Ogun State. Dressed in a fake beard and traditional wrapper, he boarded a hired chopper under a false identity. But he never got off the ground. Clara had anticipated the move. An anonymous tip from one of Kelvin's old pilots ensured his arrest on the spot. The footage of Nonso being dragged from the helicopter in handcuffs played on national TV like a final episode of a scandalous drama. As for Gideon, he doubled down. With his pride bruised and cornered by shame, he did the one thing no one expected. He ordered one final hit. "And Joan," he told his last remaining guard. "Make it look like an accident. She's the reason everything crumbled." The plan failed before it began. The assassin sent to eliminate Joan was caught after attempting to break into her safe house. He didn't know she was no longer alone. She had been moved under government protection thanks to Clara's judicial connections. The man was detained and under pressure. He confessed, naming Gideon as the one who gave the order. That final act was the nail in the coffin. What had once been a corporate trial now became criminal. Gideon was arrested the next day. Cameras captured the moment clearly. The once proud heir of the Obiora legacy being shoved into the back of a black SUV, screaming about betrayal. "He took everything from me. I'm the first son. I should have been king," he roared. The world didn't pity him. They pitied the name he had dragged through dirt. And they saluted the man who survived him. In the hospital where Joan was recovering, news of the arrests played softly on the television. She stared at the screen, unmoving. Kelvin entered quietly, carrying a bouquet. "It's over," he said gently. "They're finished." Joan nodded slowly. "Not yet. You haven't forgiven yourself." He sat beside her, his voice low. "I should have believed you the first night. I let them come too close." She took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "They thought they buried you. They didn't know you were a seed." For a long moment they sat in silence. No titles, no wealth, just two souls stitched together by suffering. Outside, the city roared with news and noise. But inside that room there was only one truth. The fire Gideon and Nonso lit had consumed them, and in its ashes something stronger had risen. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the final day of proceedings. Journalists, former shareholders, curious citizens, and legal watchdogs from across Nigeria filled every corner. Kelvin sat quietly at the front, wearing a simple black suit, no fanfare, no chains of gold. His face was composed, but his eyes were focused, sharp and calm, like the man his father had always hoped he would become. Beside him sat Clara, dignified and relentless, and behind him was Joan, walking for the first time without her arm in a sling, her strength restored if not her scars. Across the aisle, Gideon sat in handcuffs, his face pale and sunken, his eyes hollow. His once well-groomed beard had grown unruly. The fall from grace was no longer metaphorical. It was visible. It was final. Nonso refused to attend. He had pleaded guilty earlier that week, hoping for reduced sentencing. He would serve 10 years for fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Gideon, however, was still holding out, desperate to be seen as the wronged one. The judge delivered the final verdict with clarity. "This court finds that Mr. Gideon Obiora conspired with Mr. Nonso Obiora to commit corporate fraud, attempted murder, and financial embezzlement against Obiora Group and Mr. Kelvin Obiora. He is hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison with no option for parole for the first 10. Gasps filled the courtroom. Gideon didn't speak. He simply bowed his head, a broken man. The judge turned to Kelvin. "This court recognizes that Mr. Kelvin Obiora was unjustly declared deceased, and through overwhelming evidence, his identity, innocence, and rights are restored. The board is hereby ordered to reinstate him as chairman and CEO of Obiora Group effective immediately. The room broke into applause, restrained, respectful, but filled with relief. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about seeing right finally conquer wrong. A story that had begun in whispers had ended in a public reckoning. And the man who refused to die had risen stronger than ever. Later that evening, a quiet press briefing was held. No red carpets, no fireworks, no champagne. Kelvin stood behind the podium for exactly 5 minutes. "This victory isn't mine alone," he said. "It belongs to those who stood beside me when I had nothing but my breath, to those who whispered the truth even when no one listened, to Joan, to Clara, to every silent worker in this empire who stayed loyal when it would have been easier to run. You are the reason I'm standing here today. I reclaim this crown not to wear it higher, but to wear it better." Then he stepped away, refusing further questions. That night, the city celebrated. But Kelvin didn't join. He returned to the place where it all began, the clinic where he woke up burned and broken. And he stared out the same window, watching the lights of Lagos stretch beyond the horizon. The crown had returned to his head, but this time it came with thorns. The ceremony was held quietly at the Obiora estate. No press, no board members, no suits. Just a gathering of the people who had mattered most through the storm. It was Kelvin's idea, a personal moment to thank the woman who had risked everything for him. Joan stood at the center of the living room she had once mopped in silence, now surrounded by staff who once ignored her, investors who once overlooked her, and the man whose life she had saved. She wore a simple white dress. Her hair was combed back. Her face held a grace that no crown could ever rival. Kelvin stepped forward and lifted a small golden badge, not an expensive piece of jewelry, but a symbolic token. For loyalty, it read. He pinned it gently onto her dress. This house, this company, and this name survived because one woman chose to speak when it was dangerous to do so. Joan, you are no longer a maid. You are the heart of this family. Joan, for the first time, cried in public. Not because she was afraid, not because she was hurt, but because for once she was seen. "I didn't do this for recognition," she said softly. "I did it because someone had to." Her voice cracked. So many people keep quiet in places like this. So many believe that if they're not born into power, they can't hold any. But I learned that truth is its own weapon. And when you speak it, even the most powerful men tremble. Her words moved through the room, like wind through fire. Even the older investors bowed their heads. For all their degrees, none had shown the courage this woman had. And so Obiora Group made an official declaration. Joan would now serve as head of internal integrity and staff welfare. A new department formed to ensure no voice, no matter how small, would be ignored again. It was the first time a former domestic staff member was honored in company policy. But it wouldn't be the last. As the sun dipped behind the estate, Kelvin and Joan sat beneath the same mango tree where he used to study as a boy. The war was over. The wound still fresh, but healing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't knocked on my door that night?" he asked. Joan smiled. "Every day. And every day, I thank God I didn't stay silent." Kelvin nodded. "You didn't just save me, Joan. You saved the legacy. You saved the name." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I just reminded it who it belonged to." They laughed softly, letting the silence between them speak louder than any words. Around them, the estate breathed new life. The poison had been purged, the traitors gone, and in their place stood something better, not perfect, but honest. And in the center of it all, the woman who had whispered the truth, and in doing so, saved a kingdom. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.